Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives. Today on Good Sex at NYU, we are welcoming Ruby Carmel. Ruby is in her last semester of NYU Tisch's production and design studio, where she studies theatrical management, production, and intimacy direction. She works as an electrician, cheesemonger, and community organizer. Other interests include getting lost in stories, dancing, and being with nature as often as possible. Ruby, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we get started? And also, can you share your pronouns with us?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. My pronouns are either she, her, or em, but anything with respect is fine.
Awesome. I have so many questions about your bio stuff, but I'm let's talk about cheesemonger. Let's talk about intimacy direction. So many questions, but I'll move on. We want to try to make this space equitable. Mm-hmm. And so in order to do that, we want to let you know that we want to honor your boundaries. At any point there's a question that you don't want to answer, then just feel free to let us know, and we'll move forward. But if you want to turn any of these questions around, feel free to do that. We know that this takes a lot of vulnerability. So if you want us to also be vulnerable in that journey with you, then we're willing to be there with you.
Thanks. Yeah.
So,
cool.
With that said, can you tell us one thing that you enjoy about being part of the NYU community?
Yeah. So I have an interesting trajectory with NYU. I'm a transfer student. So I came to NYU 2.5 years ago, and this is my last semester. And something I've appreciated coming from a very small liberal arts school is just how many different types of people make up the NYU community, because it's 60,000 something people, and that's just the student body. And so the idea that I come in with a specific set of perspectives and experiences, and then I could meet someone who the only thing we have in common is that we're NYU students. And the ways in which that prompts us to be better listeners and be more engaged in learning about difference.
That speaks very much to what we talk about here on the podcast in terms of, and why we do this, right? Because you might think I have nothing in common with a lot of these people at NYU, and you might be surprised that some of these other things that we don't talk about as frequently might be actual similarities.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us about your first crush or current crush? Was it a real person, literary character, TV character, musician?
Yeah, sure. So I think I have a vivid memory, and I couldn't really place it location-wise, but in kindergarten, someone, I'm going to say it was on the school bus or something. They were like, oh, do you have a crush on anyone? And I had no idea what a crush was. I was like, I don't know what this means. I was like, I think it means you like being around someone or spending time with it, whatever. I was like, oh, there's this kid in my kindergarten class who lets me play with Legos with. And so I was like, oh, I have a crush on this person because we play with Legos together. And I was like, this is not. And then in later years, I was like, oh, But that was, I guess, my first official crush. And then over time, it's been here's what a crush actually feels like, or what this is, or now I'm thinking about this person all the time. But yeah.
I really like, though, that this person let you share their Legos with them. I mean, that's a good relationship
honestly,
sign, right?
Still to this day, I'm like, if you let me play with Legos with you, I'm going to enjoy spending time with you.
You share your Legos with me.
Exactly.
That is a really good green flag.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey with personal boundaries and how they intersect with your communication skills and what that sort of experience has been like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mom's a therapist.
Ooh.
So that's my the background I come from is We talk about our feelings. We talk about everything. Everything has some sort of emotional impact and connection, which made me I would say made me grow up with very little sort of shame around feeling things and expressing my feelings. And I feel very confident in articulating how I feel. But I also will say that, like, growing up, I was very much like a people pleaser, and I like to fix problems. So in that, a lot of time it would be like, something's wrong, like, let me take care of it, let me fix it, and not sort of taking time to pause and be like, well, is that crossing a boundary for me? Is this something like I actually want to be doing or not? And like over time and, you know, being in therapy myself and like talking with everyone under the sun, just like the idea of like, okay, like setting a boundary is actually like something that will help deepen a connection rather than like closing off connections. Because if I don't set that boundary with someone, then they have no idea, first off, that like they're violating a boundary. But like my guard's always going to be up around them because they continue to cross this boundary. And so I'm not going to be able to relax and like be present with them in the same way I could otherwise.
I think that's really powerful. The being able to set a boundary deepens a relationship. I just wanted to go back to it. I think that's just such a good point.
And like, I really deeply believe this and have a hard time embodying it for sure. I definitely I have a friend who will call me out for being like, when they're like, oh, how are you? And I'm like, oh, well, you know, like I had a hard day, and then I always like will qualify it with like, oh, but I'll be okay. And then being like, you don't have to be okay. Like it's not going to make the world end if you're not okay. So yeah.
Yeah.
And so many times when people say, how are you doing? And we just say, fine.
Right.
At least you're like trying to be honest about how you're feeling, but then you're like, but it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. It's like, I don't want to make this your problem. And it's like, sometimes it's okay that it doesn't have to be someone's to fix for it to not be okay.
Yeah. They can just listen.
Yeah.
And they don't have to fix. I think that's another like really important thing to learn as a listener.
Yeah.
And that's part of good communication, right? Being a good listener, to be able to like, I don't have to fix it. All I have to do is listen, and listen is huge.
That's the thing I'm definitely still working on for sure.
Yeah. How do you see communication and boundaries pop up in your sexual or intimate relationships?
I mean, for me, that's like everything. That's like number one foundational anything. I will say for me, like, firstly, just like I like to be like very blunt and straightforward about things, have conversations like, oh, like, love flirting with people. Flirting is fun, but at some point it's like, okay, are we actually interested in each other? What are our expectations? I think setting expectations early. I would rather set an expectation, like do the work to be like, oh, let's like sit down and like talk about expectations, like what we want out of this, than like 3 months down the road be like, this isn't working, and like have spent all that time and emotional energy to like then be there. So I think that's a big part of it. In terms of like sexual intimacy, like I play in kink worlds and like kink spheres. So like communication is everything there. So it's like before you are even like, I don't know, in a space alone together, it's like talking about like limits and boundaries and all these things of like what is safe, what is healthy, what is like enjoyable for us.
What is sexy and pleasurable.
Exactly. And like aftercare, like what's happening for an entire interaction rather than just like a moment.
Yeah, April and I have talked, we had an episode on kinks, and we can learn so much from that community. And
like the modeling, even just like I take that, because I don't always play in kink, and some people do for sure. But like taking that model of like negotiation and like consent communication and into like any type of play and intimacy is like, oh, it's a great model for being able to like have honest, straight up communication.
Yeah. Any relationship can benefit from not making assumptions, clarifying things, and it's like getting consent.
Oh, how do you unwind? Great to know for anyone. Yeah.
And how do you think that communication comes up when it comes to conflict? I mean, maybe it's in the BDSM kink world, but maybe it's just in regular relationships. How do you deal and manage with conflict when that comes up in your journey?
I would say like the thing I have been working on for myself is like bringing stuff up when it bothers me. I feel like if someone comes to me, I'm like, great, let's talk about it. Let's like process. Let's like, I want to like own my stuff. Like, here's things you might not have been aware of that like affected me. But definitely the piece of like, oh, hey, like you crossed one of my boundaries. Can we talk about it? But in terms of conflict, I like I was saying, my mom's a therapist. We have an anecdotal story I like of some family friends came to visit, and during the time that they were staying, there was like, one of them was like 12 or something. And I was, you know, a little bit older. But my mom and I got in this argument and like fundamental disagreement and just sort of like really like, oh, we don't see eye to eye on this. And we had what for us would be considered an argument, but it was truly like we sat in the living room for like 2 to 3 hours and just like talked through every single point of like what this interaction had been, like how it made us feel, like where we were trying to get to. And then this family friend was like looking between us, just like shocked, like, I've never seen anyone do this. Like, what is that? That was the first time I sort of realized, like, oh, people don't typically do that when they're in conflict. But like, yeah, I'm very big on like, I would like to be called out if I've crossed a boundary. Like, I would like to talk about it. And like, just because like harm has been caused, perhaps, doesn't mean that like there was malicious intent, that you're a bad person, that like we can't have a relationship, but just like the ideas of like acknowledging and owning everyone's part in things and like moving forward with the intention to change that behavior.
Yeah, that really sounds like restorative practice.
Yeah, I do a lot of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of that. And I really like that. And I think you're right that not a lot of people approach conflict in that way, nor do they have the skills.
Yeah, and also like acknowledging like it's a heavy lift, especially like if you've been hurt and like coming to the table to talk with someone who's hurt, like sometimes it's better to just be like, I don't want to see that person again, and like walk away. Yeah. And that's like totally fine too. But the idea of like, oh, like, is there a world in which like instead of screaming at each other or like gossiping behind each other's back, that we just like try to address this in the moment, or, you know, take some time and then come back to it.
Yeah. Everyone does bring so much to conflict, like their past history, trauma, all of the above, right? Absolutely. And so it can be really complex when dealing with other humans.
Yes.
In conflict. So it's good that you have some good strategies and skills already set in place.
Yeah, I hope so.
I'm curious to bring in, we talked about your intimacy coordination work, and that seems like something that takes a lot of communication. Yeah. I'm curious if you want to share sort of what intimacy coordination is and how communication plays a role there, and kind of like how you became interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like qualifying all of this with like, I'm still studying this. So like there's definitely experts who are more knowledgeable than me. But the idea of intimacy coordination and direction is a fairly new, like about a decade old field in theater and film and performance, wherein like if you're staging moments of intimacy, so like simulated sex, nudity, those kinds of things, you bring in an intimacy coordinator to the performance and rehearsal spaces to sort of hold space and make sure that like people aren't being taken advantage of, boundaries aren't being crossed, everything's being treated in like, I mean, honestly, there's like a very desexualized, very like pragmatic way. So for instance, like I'm intimacy directing on a show right now, and a lot of it is just having conversations with the actors who are, you know, performing the intimacy of being like, okay, like let's talk about physical boundaries, emotional boundaries. Are there certain like words we want? Like a lot of it is like, we don't use slang for body parts and things like that. But just like the idea of like really holding a container where it's like only the person performing the intimacy can give consent for that. It's not like the director can just be like, oh, and now you kiss, and then like they have to. It's like, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make it safe? We're going to like tap in and tap out so that there's a container for it, like different ways of like making sure that like the care is held and like the space is being like made for that.
I feel like we all need an intimacy coach.
Yeah. It's great. It's so fun.
I'm also hearing that within the confines of an intimacy coach that you're not just talking about physical intimacy.
I would say like in terms of like union contracts and stuff like that, it's like you need an intimacy coordinator on set when there's simulated sex and when there's nudity. But a lot of people will opt to hire one for like moments of intense emotional intimacy, or like if there's a show with a lot of arguments or a lot of like family trauma or something like that, like things that are like really intense. And I think a lot of it, like we talk about, I do a lot of role play games as well, and we talk about bleed there, of the idea of like, okay, I'm embodying a character and I'm doing this, but same for the acting of like, I'm doing this stuff as this character and then I'm walking away, but the body doesn't recognize that you're playing pretend or not. I mean, and then so it's like, okay, like how do we unwind and tell ourselves like, that was pretend, this is not me, like I didn't just shout at someone for 6 hours straight with intent to harm them, like this is a character I'm playing.
Yeah. So fascinating. Often I think about intimacy coaches for the person who might be also experiencing like violence in a scene, but also I'd imagine that the person who is causing the violence would need that kind of emotional support as well. So sort of encompasses both characters and how
and different kinds of support.
Yeah.
It's kind of, it makes me think of like aftercare in sex where it's like, oh, what works for me to unwind is not going to be the same as what works for anyone else. And like being clear about like, oh, like I need time alone doesn't mean I had a bad time or I'm ignoring someone. It means like I just need to like process. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah.
And everyone copes differently too. Both, you know, somebody who's receiving violence or portraying violence, you know, might need different things.
Absolutely. And different things might affect someone stronger than others. And like I was working on a show with someone who was like, oh, like initially was like, this is totally fine. And then like by like week 3 or 4 of doing this was like doing this every day is slowly like wearing away at me. Yeah. And so recognizing like lasting effect too.
Yeah. Since we're talking about intimacy, I'm curious if we can talk a little bit more about how you experience the intimacy outside of maybe some of the traditional notions of what romantic and sexual intimacy is, right? Because I think oftentimes we do think of the physical and maybe even the emotional, but I know that there's like experiential, spiritual, intellectual. So I'm wondering how you experience that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like, again, sort of like the way I was raised was very like open to like doing what, like I feel like a lot of times I encounter people my age or whatever who are like, oh, like, I don't know, I was allowed to like feel things or like let myself like do things. I've recently sort of like been reading works about pleasure activism, which has been super exciting for me. The idea of like, oh, like if this feels good and I'm not harming myself and I'm not harming anyone else, then why shouldn't I? Like that idea of like pursuing things that bring joy and bring pleasure. So for me, it's like, oh, like I love intimacy. I love being vulnerable, being close with people, being close with, you know, community, all of that. I think in terms of specific examples, like I this summer spent 3 weeks at a retreat that was, I call it a meditation retreat for short, but it was focused on interbeing, which is a Buddhist philosophy around interconnectedness with like all beings in the world. So like the idea of like in a sheet of paper, you can see like the clouds that made the rain that grew the trees that like created this piece of paper. And so that like in that way, everything is connected and that the actions of any one person, any one being will have impact on everything else. And looking at that through like a climate justice lens and that kind of thing. But it was, a community was 14 people. We were like living in tents, no technology, all of that, but like really like the idea of like focusing on community building. And they had this this guideline that I had never heard before of no exclusive relationships. So the intention being like, okay, yeah, like you're gonna like gravitate towards certain people naturally, but really making a point to like not spend all of your time with one person or a few people and like making space to connect with everyone who's there and who's present, which was a really, initially when I heard that I was like, this feels weird, but then like embodying it and feeling like, oh, now I feel like I am comfortable being vulnerable with so many more people in so many more ways because of that.
Yeah. Sounds like it had a really good impact.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend. But I know it's not for everyone.
Well, I like that it's also experiential. It's based on like a spiritual connection. And I'm also really loving that you bring up pleasure because I think oftentimes, you know, April and I talk a lot about pleasure being more than just sex. Yeah. Right? We need to like have joy in, you know, our body, but also so many other ways, so many different levels of pleasure that we overlook, we minimize.
It makes me think of like, I hear this a lot of like people who are like college freshmen or whatever being like, I'm on my own for the first time. I can like go buy cake for dinner and like nobody's gonna stop me. And like as an example, but like for myself, I often find like, oh, like I love like silly things. So like I'll just like go buy bubbles and blow bubbles for a while or like get stickers and just like put them on my desk and like, why not? And just things where it's like, oh, like you're grown up, like act mature, whatever. It's like, well, what's that in service of? And if it's partly not to get all like philosophically whatever, but like in service of like capitalist workforce and like being the idea of like just being valuable for the labor you provide. but also this like, what is really making me enjoy living life and being present, and what's going to make me feel like more myself.
Yeah. There's actually some studies that show, and I can't quote them, but there are studies that show if you are able to access that childlike state a little bit more often, that builds resiliency.
That makes a lot of sense.
I think you're onto something. I'm really going to steal the blowing bubbles because it's been ages since I've done
Or like
that.
if you see a playground and like nobody's on a playground, oh, so fun. Yeah.
So what were some of the dominant messages that you grew up with about sex and relationships? And, you know, how has this shaped your perspective?
Yeah. I feel like I grew up in a household that was like very open to things, but just like also just didn't talk about things that much. I was like, in terms of like what I had modeled for me, like my grandmother was a lesbian, my aunt's trans, like my family is very queer and open to that kind of thing. So there was never stigma around like relationship types or styles. I would say, yeah, it was like if I were to ask a question, I would get a lot of education about it, but it wasn't super like brought to me. So that was sort of my initial stuff. And then like I would say like I grew up in Massachusetts. So in terms of like sex ed in schools, that was very comprehensive comparatively, but was still very much like, okay, like here's like 5th grade, you learn like anatomy and physiology, and like 7th grade, you learn like what a period is. And like, I don't know, in high school, you learn like contraceptions and like, I don't know, different types of sex, ish. But even like that, not very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very biology-based.
Biology-based. I mean, a lot of consent-based stuff too, which I really appreciated. But it definitely like wasn't like pleasure-focused sex ed. It was like, okay, like here's what sex is. Here's how to like avoid getting STIs. Here's how to like talk about consent, and like that was kind of it.
So what are some other things that you've done since high school to kind of educate yourself beyond some of those basic resources?
Yeah, absolutely.
And anything that you found particularly helpful?
Yeah, so I've been, I guess I don't know, like I never really came out. I've been queer since I was in middle school, and just kind of was like, oh yeah, that's a thing, sure. But I remember being in like, gotta be high school or something, and just kind of like on YouTube on my like iPod Touch being like lesbian sex ed, and being like, I've never learned how to have sex as a queer person. I would like to learn this. And YouTube was very unhelpful. But also it just like was like no results. And I was like, this seems wrong for many reasons. But just like I would find like books and stuff to read. And ultimately I found Instagram has been the most useful sex education tool I've found for myself. I like reading like academic knowledge, but it definitely like takes more effort for me to like start that. And so for me, it was like, oh, like it bite-sized information that like and it started with like, as algorithms tend to, I was like, oh, like I'll follow a sex ed account. And then it was like recommending others. And I was like, oh, I can learn more about this. Great. And I tend to really like, if I have a hobby or like I enjoy something, I'm like, I want to know everything about it. So then it was like, okay, this was also like, I think I started like learning about sex ed on Instagram in like early pandemic days. So then I was like, well, I need a hobby. I gotta like learn everything about sex. So spent a lot of time down Instagram rabbit holes for sure.
So there was some positive results or, you know, implications of the pandemic.
I mean, you know, we gotta add a silver lining to something.
Yeah, gotta have that.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite or like top 2 accounts that you follow?
Sex Ed with DB was the first one I found, but I think that account is less prevalent nowadays. Ask Goody is nice. There's more. I could find more.
Well, you can also share them with us, and we'll put them on our summary page of this episode.
Yeah, and I would say like the thing about Instagram, especially nowadays, because everyone has an Instagram account or whatever. Like, and I say this as someone who like, doesn't use social media very much, but like I like it for its educational purposes. But it's like, oh, like if I want to find like kink education, I can find an account like that. If I want to find something, like there's people who like run sex ed podcasts like y'all, and it's like, oh, like if I learn through podcasts, like I could find more podcasts or like different things like that.
Yeah.
And that's good too, because it seemed like we've heard from a lot of people previously that didn't have good sex ed, that a lot of people turn to porn and a lot of people just Google things, and those aren't always the most educational or realistic. And so it's good to hear that there are lots of educational and positive resources out there as well.
Yeah. And I will say, I will also acknowledge, like, for myself, I was raised with like a healthy, like, academic skepticism of things. So it's like, I definitely Googled things. Like, Urban Dictionary taught me a whole lot as a kid, but also then coming to realize, like, okay, like, I've heard it from this source. Let me verify it. Let me make sure that what I'm learning feels accurate, feels true. And let me get it from like go into it trying to avoid confirmation bias of like, I'm not going to type a leading question into a search engine. I'm going to be like, what are the facts? So that's been helpful for me as well. But
a good skill for all different types of topics.
Yeah, for sure. And also like acknowledge like porn is fun or can be fun. I'm not a huge fan of watching porn, but I definitely read porn. And being like, this is for entertainment value rather than for education. And like coming into it with that lens and being like, okay, what can I pick apart of like, this seems fun and this seems like you are a trained athlete. And that's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that good, healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
So what or who has played a significant role in your sex and relationship journey, and how have they influenced you?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, like, I didn't have sex until I was in college. Didn't date anyone until I was in college. And the first school I went to was a small liberal arts school on the West Coast with the unofficial motto of communism, atheism, free love, which was the students took to heart, I would say. And also like being in a space where I'm like, I've always been super queer and super out about it, but like being in a space where like most people are also queer and out about it. And being in theater, you know, the theater department's pretty queer in general. So I'd say like just being in that environment was definitely like, oh, like I tend to, until I feel like I am an expert in something, not even try to start anything, which is not a great skill. I'm trying to unlearn it because making mistakes is a great thing, can lead to a lot of learning and generative stuff. But being there was helpful to me in being able to feel like, oh, I can try things and they don't have to be super like new or scary or whatever for them to be like useful, or like learning what I don't like is as important as learning what I do like. So I think that was like a first like put like the nudge I needed to start exploring things. I will say like a big impact for me was I was in a long distance relationship during the pandemic for 2 years almost, and that was definitely like that was fun in being able to like sort of put into practice things I had learned in theory of like, oh, like I have a partner I'm having sex with regularly. How do we have phone sex? Like, what is that? What is exploring being in an open relationship? What is exploring polyamory? What is exploring kink? Like, in practice as well. Like, and I would say, like, if I were to give advice, I don't think I'm qualified, but if I were, the idea of, like, exploring things for yourself and what you like without being in the context of a specific, like, relationship with other person or other people feels like start there. Absolutely. Find like things you like, but then like, okay, now what? Like try it out with other people, see what works in combinations and that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's pretty good advice. It's kind of similar to the advice around boundaries.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need to push our own. Like if we get like kind of stuck in our own little box, we're comfortable, we're safe, but are we fully living authentically and enjoying ourselves completely? Maybe we need to push it, but also like reel it in. If that's not a boundary that we want to like, you know, engage in, then we've learned that.
No, that's huge. I know for myself, it was like, oh, like I feel like, especially like the first few times I had sex with people, I was like, oh, like I don't know anything. I'm so new at this and I don't want them to like, I don't want to like seem inexperienced. So I'm just going to like not say anything or like not even not say anything, but just like, I'm not going to like have preferences or like anything, and not in a way that like I think I've always felt pretty comfortable to be like, hey, I don't like this, like can we do something else, but just like I had a partner be like, what do you like? And I was like, I don't know, but I didn't want to say that, so I didn't really say anything, and just the idea of like being like on the receiving end of someone being like, I don't know, is got to be so frustrating. And that like even if it's like, hey, I'm not sure, but I'd like to try something, or just like being able to be like, here, let's try this and see what happens from there. And then we'll modify as we go.
Yeah.
I said, we've talked a lot about how a lot of times people discover boundaries by doing something that they're like, oh, I'm not sure if I really like that, but they're open, and maybe something that somebody's never tried before. They're like, okay, yeah, let's try this. And then realizing like, nope, don't really like that. That has now become a boundary for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just going to comment on the receiving end of someone not knowing what they like. I think that it can also be an opportunity for exploration.
Yeah.
And to turn people on to things. And so long as we're communicative, to be like, let me know if something doesn't feel right, we can stop any second. Absolutely. Like, I'm not wielded to like this one thing we have to do. I'm open and like excited to help you explore that.
Yeah. And also being like, okay to own the like, I don't know, rather than being like, this is a thing I need to be ashamed of or like whatever. Like, I don't need to be an expert to have a good time.
There's that stigma that like we have to know going in.
Right. And it's like
I gotta seem like I'm an expert. But in reality, you're with a new person. You're not an expert of that person. We might know technically how parts work, but like we don't know what the other person's like pleasure zones and what like gets them off. So we kind of need to ask.
Exactly. And also like what I've enjoyed today might be not what I enjoy in 6 weeks or whatever.
Exactly.
Like I know for myself, like things that I have brought, honestly, this is like from like theater work that I bring into my life of like access check-ins are huge for me. Like I have disabilities, so like I can't use my arms all the time. That impacts how I have sex with people. Or like ways in which it's like, oh, like I can't support weight today or tomorrow or whatever. And just being able to be like, hey, just because I am saying no to this thing right now, please keep checking in with me about it. Like, these are my hard limits. These will always be a no. But here's a soft limit. Like, here's something that's flexible today. Ask again, like reaffirming that like sometimes a no is always a no, and sometimes it's like, right now I don't want this, and later I want you to keep asking me about this.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
What does a healthy relationship mean to you, and how did you discover your own needs and wants in a relationship?
Ooh, such a big question. I mean, for me, the idea is that like all participants in the relationship feel like they are getting something generative and sustainable out of it. They are being respected for their boundaries. They have the space to voice concerns, to give feedback, to receive feedback, without fear of like danger to themselves or others. So that at its heart, also just like, I don't know, enjoying being in each other's company. That's big for me. Like any type of relationship being like, hey, I like being around you and want to keep being around you.
Yeah, imagine that.
What a concept. And then in terms of like romantic relationship, for me, I'm like, this is the thing I say with my friends a lot of the time. I'm like, I don't want to date someone who's not my friend. And it doesn't have to be like we were friends first, but I'm like, I want to feel like we can be friends and do friend things as well as like be partners and do partner things. And often I find like that line is very wobbly and like doesn't always, yeah.
And so are there any specific cultural or religious beliefs that have influenced your views on sex and relationship? And how do you navigate conflicts or tensions that might arise with these beliefs?
Yeah. My first instinct is like, no. And then I'm like, well, that's not true. Because I'm like, no, because I don't have religious trauma. I'm like, that's a very specific thing. I would say like, I definitely like grew up with the idea of monogamy, not like imposed on me, but like those were the examples I saw. So like coming into the idea of like, oh, like I could be in a relationship with more than one person as long as it's consensual and communicative. Like, whoa, what a concept. Things like that took more time to learn. Yeah, I think honestly for me, the big piece is the like, I like trying to remember, like, I like when other people try things, so I should try things. And like being empowered to be like, I want to try something, and it's okay if it's okay if it ends in laughter on the floor. It's okay if it's like, hey, maybe not. It's okay if it's just like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
But like bringing nothing to the table doesn't create forward progress in any direction.
Yeah, so maybe the cultural norm there is being willing to make mistakes and
being
not be
willing
perfect.
to make mistakes,
I think there's
absolutely.
the pressure of being perfect. And
yes, yeah. gifted and talented middle schooler.
Yeah. What has been some of the most challenging aspects of navigating some of those non-traditional relationship models, and how have you worked through some of those challenges?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me, and I will say, like, I grew up in Massachusetts. I now live in New York. Like, I feel like I'm very fortunate to be around a lot of open-minded people in terms of relationship models. I think the biggest thing for me is often just like the exhaustion at explaining things of people of being like, I don't even like want to give all my pronouns because I don't want to explain how to use them, like, or things like that, where I'm just like, I'm tired. And I'm going to do what I'm going to do, but like, I don't want to talk about it. But like on the flip side, being like, oh, like excited at times, like if I have the energy and if it's like the right context to be like, I want to share this with you. So I'm going to like use a word that I think you won't know so that you ask me about it so that we can then like talk. But yeah, I think that's the big one. Yeah, I think then it's like dealing with like societal expectations of how people live their lives and like the ways in which things like that, like the idea of like, oh, like we are a married household with 2.5 children is entrenched in our legal system, and like the ways in which we get benefits from work and like that kind of thing, where it's like, I don't think I want kids. I don't really have an interest in like formal legal marriage. Like, what does that mean for me? Like, if I wanted to raise a kid with 3 people, like how does that look on their birth certificate? Like different things where it's like, oh, these are challenges that I'm thinking about that I don't know that other people who don't feel like this type of lifestyle is exciting for them, like would be thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And good to think about the institutional oppression.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we don't often think about.
And a lot of it, I think, too, with like the idea of like, some is like just, oh, stigma, but like some just being like, people don't know. And like being able to be like, hey, like just because you don't know doesn't mean it's bad or scary or wrong or doesn't exist.
Definitely. And I'm thinking about considering what you've shared a little bit just in this question, but also in other questions. How do you navigate the intersectionality of your identities when it comes to the context of sex and relationship? Because we know we show up as whole people in those spaces. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us any of the challenges that you've experienced or any of the joys that you've discovered and how those things interconnect.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a learning process. I think, honestly, for me, like the biggest thing has been like rechecking in with myself. Because like I used to, less so now, but like used to be like, this is my identity and I'm gonna live with it. And that's gonna be like how I present to the world. And then it's like, well, okay, that was my identity 3 years ago and it doesn't fit as well now. But I've been so loud about it, like how can I sort of revise and reset? So like making conscious choices to be like, oh, like this feels right, this doesn't, and like how much do I need to like wear that as an identity rather than as just like a comfort or like a way to provide language to things I feel. So that for sure. I think being very upfront with potential partners about different things, of being like, oh, hey, like just so you know, like this is a thing that I'm into, or this is a lifestyle that I practice, like whatever that is, of being like, oh, I'm dating someone who is also female, like just so you know, I'm bisexual, like being upfront about those kinds of things. So it's like, hey, I don't want you to feel like I'm keeping information from you. I don't want to spring things on you later. Like I want you to know what you're getting into as much as I do. Like I feel like if I'm like meeting someone new and like flirting with them a little, I'm like, oh, there might be vibes here. Like I will find a way to work into conversation like, oh, like what are your relationship deal breakers? Like just as like a curiosity, like, just out of curiosity. Just because I'm like, oh, like if we're incompatible right now, what are you willing to flex on? What am I willing to flex on? But also like, oh, I'm just not going to waste my time.
Yeah. So how often do you talk about sex in general, and with whom do you have those conversations? Like, do you feel like
often and with everyone?
Yeah.
That's an exaggeration, but like I find that like I've done, I would say like probably more than most of my peers, like independent research on like, I want to know about this and I want to advocate for things. And this is true about sex, but like other things as well. But just like, oh, like I was talking with 2 people, 2 of my friends, and like new friends, and one of them is like writing a thesis on like the intersection of like dating apps and like cultural experience with dating apps or something. So like we had been like, we got into a conversation talking about like sex and relationship and dating. And our third friend was there and he's an international student, and the only sex ed they've ever gotten was like the consent training you get like going into college. And they had never gotten any other sex. And so we were like, hold on, like let's give you some like basics about like even just like protection and stuff like that, but like also like pleasure focused like sex and like what is it like to be setting boundaries and like exploring things for yourself and discovering whatever that feels good to you, what doesn't, like what you want to be doing. But I would say, just like to get back to the question, I don't really like, of course time and place is important to be aware of, but I like very much, I'm like, yeah, like I'll talk about sex with people just I met 3 minutes ago. Like I don't, doesn't bother me. And I find that like oftentimes either I'll learn something new or like I will have imparted something new to someone, and that's exciting to me.
Connecting with you on there, I can have it anywhere, anytime. Yeah. And sometimes I have to like honor other people's boundaries.
Yeah, that's a big one for me too. I'm like, I'm fine with it. Oh wait, you're not. Like, okay, I'm gonna reel it back. Like I have a couple friends who are like, don't make sex jokes around me. I'm like, great, I won't. And I'm like, oh, gotta remember that.
I've been at places where my husband will offer the information. Oh, my wife has a sex ed podcast or like all these things. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm okay talking about this, but similarly, like, do you all want to have these conversations right now? And it's okay. We don't have to. Yeah. How important is sex in your life and in your relationships? And have there been times when it's been more important or less important?
Yeah, not that important, honestly. For me, it's like partly like what I'm excited about in like an intimate relationship is the intimacy and closeness. Like I want to be connected, but like, I don't know, I was talking to a partner over the summer and I was like, I care more about cuddles than sex. Like I want to feel connected to someone. I want to have like deep, vulnerable conversations with them. I want to get, but also like part of me is like, well, like I can make myself orgasm. Like I don't need to do that with someone. Like if you're offering, sure, like could be fun, but like it's not something I need or like crave constantly in a way that I'm like, oh, like kind of hard to make out with myself. Like I'd rather do that with a partner. So yeah, I think definitely over time has shifted for sure. I remember like my first like real like long-term partner was ace. And acknowledging like asexuality, big spectrum, whole big spectrum. But like this person like didn't want anything to do with any kind of like romantic or physical intimacy. Or not necessarily romantic, but like didn't want to kiss, didn't want to touch, like that kind of thing. And at the time I was like, oh, first relationship, I like this person, like fine, whatever. And then like coming into like after that being like, oh, actually this is something that I like more than that and would like to be consistent in my life. I mentioned being in a long distance relationship and like coming into like, what does that mean for intimacy and sex and that kind of thing. Exploring polyamory, being like, oh, like what is hookup culture? Don't love it, but sometimes I do and it's fine. But like navigating the different, like, I think available options, especially in this day and age, and like finding different ways that I enjoy sex versus don't enjoy sex.
Yeah. So in what ways do you prioritize self-care in your sexual and intimate relationships, and how does this impact your overall well-being?
Yeah. I mean, big piece is communication. So like if I have a partner that I'm like, oh, like we're both interested in having sex. Great. Established that, let's talk about it. Like, what do we like? What do we not like? Establishing boundaries, but also like I establish safe words with everyone I play with and like, hey, like, what does this mean to you? Because like, a common thing in like kink worlds is like red, yellow, green as like a stoplight system for safe words. But like everyone I've ever met has a different meaning for like, what does this fully mean? Like red, like what does that mean to you? Also like talking about aftercare is a big one for me for self-care of like, I want to know what you need. I also want you to know what I need like after we've had sex, because I'm not going to be in a headspace to be setting boundaries and asking for things then in the way that I am now. So that's a big one. And then, yeah, like I remember the first time I ever had sex was at an orgy. And I remember talking, and it was with a bunch of friends. And I remember talking to some of them afterwards and then being like, I had a good time, but then I felt so weird for the days after. I was like, what did you do after? And they were like, I just kind of like laid and stared at the ceiling. I was like, Great. I'm glad that I took a shower and drank a bunch of water and got some sleep, and like knew that about myself to like do the things that I needed to sort of reset.
Yeah. It's important to know.
I think that's really good what you said in terms of being in the mind space afterward. We talk a lot about the importance of communicating before, during, and after sex, but people think, oh, it's a little bit awkward or whatnot. And I think the aftercare specifically, like, might feel awkward, quote unquote. But I think what you said is actually more accurate in a lot of spaces, is that people just aren't in the same mindset, and they don't necessarily, like, after an experience might not be able to express things the same way. So I think that's so accurate of like thinking about it ahead of time before you're in the moment and being able to express that.
Yeah, like I'd rather have like a slightly awkward conversation over brunch than like...
Amen.
Yeah.
Awkward conversations can just lead to better experiences.
Yeah. And I was like, in my experience, like it's awkward to start the conversation. It's never going to not be awkward. Like sometimes it's like less awkward than other, but like, oh, hey, can we like be formal about this and like write things down and like share lists and like I love a good spreadsheet, but like it's not going to feel natural. But then it's like, oh, like once that's out of the way, the conversation tends to flow pretty well. And then it's like, oh, like we're talking about things we like and enjoy. That's always going to be exciting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned before not being someone who wanted to give advice, but I'm going to ask you to give some advice to your younger self as you were becoming, active sexually or having sexual urges, desires, or becoming, interested in relationships. Like, what kind of advice would you have given yourself?
Yeah. Definitely taking more time to figure out what I like. So like the idea of like, I want to start having sex or like being in relationships now. Cool. I have spent so much time making sure that like the other person feels comfortable around me, or like they can set a boundary with me or whatever. It's like, all right, so now let's flip that around and like, what are things I want to ask for? What are things I want to say? Like, this is clearly something I don't want. Those kinds of things. And then also that sex toys exist. I think I didn't know that until I knew it, but like I was like not like, oh yeah, this is the thing I could use and would be fun to use until my 20s.
There's a bit of a stigma around some of that too. And I'm not saying that impacted you, but I think for me, I was like, oh, only if I'm desperate. And
yeah, and I also like I can't use my hands a lot of the time when I have sex. I'm like, sex toys, fantastic invention. Would recommend.
Yeah, I agree. But I think like I had a bit of a stigma issue with that. And I think that that's just something I had to move past. And I hope that others won't. Maybe the younger generations are better, but I feel like for me, like I didn't have access.
That's a big one.
I was like, oh, but like you don't masturbate as someone with a vulva because like that's, and again, all horrible, negative,
no, but
oppressive.
Absolutely,
like,
yeah. And like I didn't masturbate until I was like 21. I'm just like the idea of like I definitely had a misconception about sex toys as being like so expensive and so hard to find. It's like you can get a decent vibrator online in like discreet packaging for $15. Like.
It may not last you very long, but
right? But like,
fair.
I mean,
it depends on how much you use it.
Budget friendly.
Yeah.
Well, we've made it to our last question.
Ooh, excited.
What does good sex mean to you?
Oh, I think to me, good sex is everyone involved, like coming out of the experience having had a satisfying time, and like feeling like their boundaries were respected. And also like going into it with the intention of having sex. Like I'm not a big believer in like sex looks one way or whatever. Like in fact, I don't believe in it at all. Like, I'm like sex can look any type of way or whatever you want, but like going into it with the intention of like, hey, this is sex for us, and then coming at it with like, oh, that was a great time. Like I enjoyed myself. Whoever I'm having sex with enjoyed themselves. And perhaps we want to do this again, perhaps we don't, but like. We had a good time. Yeah, it's like a positive experience, feeling like boundaries are respected.
Well, I'm also hearing that in what your idea of good sex is that you're expanding the definition of sex. What we think of as sex is sometimes very limited, and opening that up to including maybe your cuddles, to including other things, so that way this is pleasurable.
Yeah.
What kind of pleasure am I seeking? I can accomplish in this moment?
And the idea of like, I know like in high school, back to another story of like in sex ed class in high school being like, okay, sex is vaginal penetration, anal penetration, oral penetration. That's sex. It's like, Well, I'm queer. I don't know what that that looks like for me. So being able to figure out ways of like, oh, like setting intention felt like a very strong way to sort of denote that for myself, at least, of being like, oh, this is the intention. Great, this feels, and like maybe you don't have sex after setting that intention, whatever, but like, oh, okay, like this feels clearer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sex can be pleasurable. Sex does not always, like sex does not have to equate pleasure. Pleasure doesn't have to equate sex. It's kind of a,
also
we
like,
get to make all our definitions.
like, especially in this society, like the stakes are so high for having sex. I'm like, I feel like having low stakes sex is quite fun. Yeah. And being like, oh, like we're going to do this and then we're going to go grocery shopping and it's going to be great. Yeah.
Also account for some like awkwardness.
Yeah. Oh my God. Laughing during sex is so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But well, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really had a lot of fun, a lot of laughs as well.
Absolutely.
So I just so enjoy hearing about other people's journeys because I always connect in some way or another. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can share with us, you know, if there's places where folks can find you. Maybe you don't want that. If there's work that you want to point anyone into, that would be...
I mean, I'll get you whatever Instagram things I don't have in my brain. I don't use social media anymore, but come see the Tisch stage shows. Come see the student work shows. I think they're sold out, but they're pretty cool. And you can get tickets at the door.
Awesome. Anything else that you want to share on this topic or any questions you want to ask us that we didn't get a chance to?
Communication is more scary the less you do it. And the more you do it, the easier it'll be, and the more models you'll have for how you like to communicate.
That's an excellent point, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, thank you.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos. If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S. Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Baini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellon, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.